Arkell, and today my guest is Tony Abbatine. Tony is a performance coach for both the MLB and NCAA teams, a professor of sports psychology, the founder of Frozen Ropes, which is a company that supports both professional and amateur athletes in the area of mental and visual performance. And to top it all off, he's written a few books, including his most recent one, Beyond the Ball, and he has an Olympic gold medal. Tony, welcome to the show.
Todd, good to be here finally.
Good resume.
Yes.
Good resume. I'm tell the listeners I'm totally stoked about this this chat because I love what you preach and what you do. I'm not the tech nerd, so I don't understand all of it. And but I know we'll keep it at the player level, maybe along this way from the technology. So let me start first. Get right into it. This podcast has had many mentions of Ken Ravizza and his impact on modern day mental performance. And I know you've had an opportunity to spend a bunch of time with Ken in your career. And some of the things that you said was coming out of those conversations was you developing the phrase visual psychology. So can you explain, I'm going to go into another term that you said that kind of came out of those conversations, ocular agita. Can you explain that in a way that speaks to the players and not the scientists listening to this episode?
Well, first of all, you have to be Italian to be able to pronounce that the right way.
That's true. Actually, now that I see it, yeah,
it's ocular agita.
There you go.
But yeah, just a quick connect with Ken Ravizza. Ken and I spent a lot of time at Long Beach State and Cal State Fullerton back in the late '90s, and we would go back and forth. It was kind of interesting, Todd. He being the godfather, the grandfather of sports psychology. He was the one that many years ago, he was way ahead of his time in talking about the topics that are so relevant now. And it got to the point, and maybe it was over a glass of wine or two, I would say, Ken, I think you're full of poops. I think you're wrong. And he would say, Tony, only guys from New York would say that. I said, well, I hear what you're saying. I said, but what if the mental clutter, right? What if we were able to fix performance issues if we started realizing that the part of the brain, the human eyes, might be affecting a lot more than quote, the back of the brain, right? Yeah. And again, in traditional sports psychology, it's about thoughts, it's about the cognitive component to it. But at some point, and this has been my rat hole for 20 years now, if the eyes are part of the brain, and if the eyes are the only external part of the brain, why don't, particularly with athletes that have their eyes open when they play, which for most of them is all of them, yes. Why don't we spend more time on the visual processing, and to the point where maybe how and what we pay attention to affects mood and mindset. And I've said that over and over again. And I remember the article that I wrote with Ken in Baseball America back in the day. What comes first in a batting slump? Is it the hitters change in their, what I call their VSS, their visual search strategy? Are they paying attention? Are they hyper-focused? And because of that, right, stress levels go up. And because of that, the thought process gets derailed. So which one is it? And it was the classic chicken before the egg. And I used to convince Ken, well, you might be right. You might be right. He says, I think you might be onto something. And so, from that, the traditional mental skills, mental performance, sports psych, I embrace it. I think it's great, but quite frankly, I got bored with it. It just got to the point where you're dealing with high-level athletes. And I'm telling, it's all about seeing the ball, and the reason why they're not throwing strikes, right? Because of overfixation issues, possibly in the glove. And outfielders don't get great first step quickness because their inability to process space in front of the ball, which is what anticipation is all about. And so I went rogue, and the mental performance coaches that have heard me talk, Tony, you're getting a little away from mainstream. I said, you're right, and I'm not poo-pooing mindfulness. I don't teach mindfulness. right?
Right.
I want to talk about mindlessness, right? And I've got, the article that I wrote in Baseball America maybe about 8 months ago, and instead of me trying to memorize it, there were some really good quotes here that I just wanted to share as building the platform on this visual psychology. And if we're truly concerned about the zone and finding this space and time where everything is in slow motion, it's what mental skill coaches are talking about all the time. Maybe it exists. Maybe some of the tools and techniques and strategies that we're presenting to athletes is doing probably or possibly more harm than good. So if I can,
Absolutely.
right,
That's what we're here for.
using techniques to find the zone is like using witchcraft to make the sunrise. And I want your audience to listen to that, okay? Employing a mental strategy and then feeling better is called a coincidence. Getting on with life and then self-correcting is called truth. Athletes find excellence through the absence of thought. Why aren't the coaches connecting the dots? They keep prescribing techniques that require athletes to think. And I'll raise my hand. I'm guilty as charged. We used to just unload the truck and we're going to work on our visualization and our affirmation and our breathing and our meditation, and we're going to journal and we're going to goal set. And I think those are great traits to have for people like you and I, Todd, in normal activity. When you're talking about high-level athletes, I'm not so convinced that the traditional mindfulness tools are going to separate them from good to great. There's no connection between performance excellence and positive thinking. Whoa. Stop trying to find a state of no thought by adding thought. And when you start digesting that, I think some of the performance coaches, their immediate reaction is, you know what, Tony, you're wrong. This is not about right or wrong. This is about results. And quite frankly, we have a generation of athletes. We have a generation of children, young people, old people that are so stressed out that anxiety levels that are off the charts. Maybe the traditional mental performance model isn't working for all. That's really the message today. This is not discarding what I call the platform, the baseline, but this whole, I'm going to employ third-party strategies and techniques for me to be able to find myself, right? And right. I think what's interesting, Sydney Banks, Garrett Kramer, some of your mental skills coaches or people in general, you want to start reading some stuff that's off the main highway. These are the guys that have said, we need to just reevaluate sometimes this whole mental performance model, that it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Okay. It is helpful to some, but at some point, when you start really understanding thought, consciousness, and mind and the self, and however we define the self, you might define the self as God or the man upstairs. In Buddhism, right, they talk about the Tao. They talk about the soul, the power source to an extent. If we're trying to get athletes and people to have that relationship be the primary one, I think we need to start evaluating how much stuff and techniques that we're presenting to them. Self-help is an interesting phrase. How can employing someone else's motivation or a mental strategy be self-help? You're laughing, Todd. Okay.
I am, because it's thought-provoking. It's the reality is, I would say, if you look at most of my guests, we talk about breath work and we talk about, visual, like all of what you've talked about, and now you're here going, maybe not.
I'm saying kudos to them, Neil Martin and Jeremy. I think that's tremendous. And if they have had 100% success in all their athletes with those tools, that's great. But guess what? We're not. There's not one mental performance coach that you'll have on after me or before me and can say that they 100% are getting people back to their self, right? And so I think that's really the challenge. And I think the players and the coaches and parents that might be listening, perhaps, as the article talks about, perhaps your best mental skill coach is sitting right in looking at yourself in the mirror. That this
Right.
inside out way of looking at things could be an option for many people.
Yeah. And I think, you know what, I don't disagree with that statement. I also would, not challenge, but articulate, I think with kids, especially, teenagers, sometimes I believe a lot of the stuff we're talking about at least provides them some guidance and maybe can lead them on some journey of self-discovery as well, right? Like, people talk about, well, find your why. In a lot of cases, that sounds a little woo-woo as well. But for a kid who may be playing a sport and they just love it, and all of a sudden they're like 16 and it's like, oh, this might happen to that. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, why am I doing this?
Right.
And so I think there's value in some of those instruction to more, I look at it as self-reflection or evaluation on yourself and why are you doing this? And what are ways that if you feel stressed out, you can calm down, right? Now that leads.
I would agree. My good friend, Alan Jaeger, right?
Yep.
He and I talk about this all the time. The breath, meditation, those are all bridges back to the self. Those should be guardrails to bring people back in to self-correct. They are not the end technique. They are not the end conclusion. So you're right. For a young player to just simply tell them to self-correct is going to be a tough thing to do. But the challenge that I have and where I believe the industry has gone, instead of these being reboots and resets, they become the highway. They become the techniques, right? That now athletes in the middle of crisis are trying to grab and trying to formulate and think about. And I said it before, right? It's the absence of thought is where elite players live. It's the absence of thought that reduces worry and anxiety in everyday people. So I think you've got to be very careful in how you're presenting these tools. And that's why I don't like the word tools. These are just simply reminders, right?
Sure.
Introduce the breath, right? Understand the power of meditation, and then let the athlete, let the player themselves just simply get back to their self and let them realize that that's the answer, right? Not the external techniques, strategies, and models that are being inundated to them at the professional level and even at the college level.
Yeah, and I mean Jeremy Sheetinger, who's a good friend of Alan's as well. I mean, he got into doing meditation with his kids, and I think my conversation with him, his thought process is the meditation he does with his team prior to a practice is really to give them an opportunity to disconnect from all the craziness that's going on during the day and then get on to practice. Right. And I think that's part of it.
And I agree. And Alan and I will have these conversations, and it's a segue into my favorite topic in mental performance, and that's open focus. Okay.
You're getting ahead of me. I got questions about that.
I think meditation is good, Todd, but the last time I looked, right, there's not too many batters or NHL goaltenders that are playing the game with their eyes closed.
That's true.
Meditation has its application, right? It's mindful, but when you start talking about the 0.5% that do this at the highest level, I think we should teach them how to meditate with their eyes open, which segues into my favorite topic in the universe, and that's Dr. Femi's open focus training. That becomes not only the bridge, but if we're going to talk about visualization and meditation, I think we can bring it a little closer to the stressors and the realities of the game. And that's where I have an issue with meditation is for everybody. We're going to lay everybody down and they're going to feel their breath. I think that's great. But there's no direct correlation between being a great meditator and being able to take that state and to take that quietness into competitive high stress at bats.
No, that's a fair comment. And so what Tony's he is relating to is Dr. Les Femi, who was a professor at Princeton. He's a pioneer in the field of neurofeedback, and he's written many, many books on open focus. So I'd like you to dive into that a little bit deeper and really explain what that means to the listeners what that concept is about, and how that connects to your work as well, and where you're kind of taking it.
Well, maybe 12 years ago, Todd, Dr. Femi was nice enough to allow me to attend one of his seminars that were only open to surgeons and people with PhDs. And he says to me, Tony, you're a doctor, but you have a JD. You can't come to this workshop. And I said, well, Doc, JD, MD, PhD, come on, we all can be doctors. And I convinced him to let me go to the 3-day workshop. And I was introduced to a concept that's been around since the 1960s. Dr. Femi, in his work in neurofeedback, would claim, and his studies seem to support, and in talking to other neurologists in the neuroscience world, that when you ask the brain to attend to space, it has a tremendous effect on mood and mindset. Okay, why do we feel so good when we're outside? How come when we're looking at sunsets, mountains, and oceans, and that gorgeous space that's outside, right? How we're looking at something is affecting our mood and mindset. And so what Dr. Femi found out is that when he would bring patients through this guided visualization of, I want you to think about the space between you and the screen right now. I want you to imagine and feel the space between the top of your head and the ceiling in this room. I want you to imagine and feel the space between your left ear and your right ear. When you ask the brain to pay attention to nothing, no thing, the brain goes on vacation. The brain says, thank you. We were wired to be this way, right? We were created, however you believe creation started, we were built to be outside. But in the world of being slammed, crammed, and jammed with technology and phones and whatnot, we've gotten away from that. So open focus is just simply learning how to live in better space, and learning that space and allowing the brain to pay attention to that space was tremendously helpful for Dr. Femi when he was reducing anxiety. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to elite athletes. I took open focus and said, you know what? I think there's a visual tracking process to this. I really think that if you can get athletes to understand space and understand that it's not about the ball, right? The book that I wrote 4 years ago, it's called Beyond the Ball. Most of the hitters that I work with now, Todd, NHL goaltenders and even soccer players now, I'll ask them, how important is it for you to look at the ball? And they all say the same thing. It's very important. Ask every Little League, high school, and probably most of the college coaches, except the ones that have worked with me, and they'll say, no, stop telling kids to look at the ball, because the ball doesn't tell the story unless you're in T-ball. But once you introduce movement, once the ball starts moving, it's about what? It's about the space in front of the ball. And so teaching 7-year-olds and 27-year-olds, right, to understand, I need to be able to process moving objects a little bit differently. I will see the ball, but I'm going to be looking for the space in front of it. So the best thing for your reader, for your audience to understand, there's a big difference in life between seeing and looking. And particularly in baseball, we have all of this information that's archaic. Watch it out of the pitcher's hand. See the ball out of the pitcher's hand. I used to say that crap too before I understood space, okay? And the difference between seeing and looking, right? You can still see the ball come out of a pitcher's hand, but you should be looking at that magical space that sits in front of the ball, right? In this runway, as I talk about with hitters all the time. Manny Ramirez, one of my, I learned more about Manny in the 5 years I spent with him in my time with the Red Sox. And he was the one, unprovoked, Tony, you know what? When I look at nothing, I see everything. And the first time he said that, I'm thinking, this is just Manny being Manny, as the expression was. Manny was a visual genius. He was not very articulate. I said to him, Manny, what did you say? He said, when I look at nothing, I see everything. Because we were talking about why he was able to hit Mariano Rivera, why he saw things way before the ball started movement. And in today's game of late movement, Manny cheated. He cheated. he saw things differently than others, not because of video, not because of studying the iPad. He was so good at, I need to see the pitcher's arm, I need to see the ball, but I'm going to beat the ball to the spot. I'm going to get my eyes in a better position, right? So this space that sits in front of the ball, I want to control the space. And this gets back to Todd. Let me just come up for air for a second.
Yeah, no.
I'll ask you this question. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you'll be in good company because you're gonna answer it wrong. Because most hitting coaches, how important is it for you to have young hitters or hitters in the big leagues, right? Have two eyes on the pitcher, right? Because it's really important to get both eyes on the pitcher because of the dominant eye theory that existed back in the 80s that has been refuted now, because once you introduce movement, there's no such thing as a dominant eye, okay? The dominant eye test is a static measurement. So my question to you and any other parent or anyone who's teaching hitting, how important is it for you to get that young hitter and have both the right eye and the left eye pointing toward the pitcher?
Well, the interesting thing is most people say you should have both facing the pitcher. They do. And I mean, when I, coaching youth baseball and higher level of baseball, I never really subscribed to that so much, right? Because I felt that every kid saw things differently. So not that I'm a genius, but I never felt that one size fits all. And that's, I think, a lot of squish the bug, stay back.
Yep.
Well, all these things.
And you were ahead of your time.
Without knowing it.
Okay. and I'll give you examples. Tony Gwynn, Rod Carew, Juan Soto. Go watch their setup. Okay. They are tilted. They are more concerned about that 15-foot marker out in front of home plate that I call the go zone. They're getting their eyes in a much better position, right, than this looking at the pitcher like it's the Snellen eye chart in an eye doctor's office. Therein lies half the problem. You talk about ball anxiety and hyperfocus. The reason why most hitters can't be visually neutral as long as possible is because they're snapping the picture too early. And in today's day of late movement, if you click the picture too early and you send that image to the brain and the brain says we have to now swing, oh Lord, guess what?
Sword.
There it is. There's that swing that the hitting coaches say, well, we got to work on staying back, right? We got to work on more rotation. We got to work on leverage and swinging through it. No, the information that the camera, the eye sent to the brain too early was the reason why that swing looks bad. That has nothing to do with your swing.
Oh, well, it's a great point because, pitching coaches talk about tunneling. Hey, that ball's got to come out of the same arm slot, whether it's a fastball changeup. And why is that effective? Maybe because the hitter's taken the picture too soon.
Okay, because they're looking in the tunnel. They should simply be seeing the tunnel. They should be in what's called non-judgmental mode. Okay, they should be curious. They need to know the difference between seeing and then the look. When I start looking, that trips the trigger. That's the camera. And the better hitters, the elite eyes, whether you're hunting, whether you're an NHL goaltender, it doesn't matter. They either have been wired that way out of the crib like a Manny Ramirez. I didn't teach Manny Ramirez about open focus. I was just smart enough to listen to him and for him to say, he's saying the same thing Dr. Femi is saying, that how and what we pay attention to not only affects his ability to be quiet, but with sports that you've got a moving stimulus, you're going to have better processing skills because of that.
Yeah, I think, when you listen to some of these guys and you look at the elite players that have come through baseball, I think a number of them can't really, they can't really translate. There may be things that they've done, but they can't translate how they saw the game. Like, I watched, Barry Bonds is a great example. His eyes are not, they're over here when he's swinging. They're to the left. Like if you see close-ups of him hitting and you're going, how did he? And then he says, oh, I just caught the ball with my bat. And I saw some video today where somebody was like, catch the ball with your bat. And I was like, okay, one guy could do that. That was his mental cue of what he was doing. But it's
Well,
like,
yeah.
you know, they're not, they don't necessarily know. I don't necessarily think Barry was probably the best hitting coach, because
Well,
how could he translate it?
He was actually a terrible hitting coach.
Yeah,
And
there
that
you go.
analogy that he uses all the time made sense for him. But
Yeah,
to me, I think what I got out of that quote that everyone has heard before is that he just simply sits there and hits like he was going to catch the ball. Okay. There was not any initial arousal. He sat there quietly, like he had a glove on, and he saw the ball come out, no different than if he was having a catch with the center fielder. And he realized that the information early wasn't really important. And yes, hitters need to see the arm because they have to start the swing. The challenge becomes when they use that initial movement as a way of starting to make a decision to swing, they get in trouble. Right? And again, look no further than the guys are in the big leagues, and then you've got a generation of guys whose numbers are great in Double A and Triple A. They get to the big leagues, and what happens, Todd? Well, now we're going to give them all the mental techniques. We're going to have them thinking all the time, over and over again. The best hitters, right, simply let their eyes control their body, and you can't let the eyes control the body if the brain is hunting for other information, right? The brain is really good at doing one thing really well. And if you make the visual seeing part the most important part and learn how to shut off the back of the brain, right, you have a chance to be an elite hitter. And I think that's where I struggle at times with the traditional mental performance coach. I'll have these conversations and the coach will say, Tony, that's more of a vision thing. That's more of a, you should really talk more with the hitting coaches. Really? Really? Okay. The mental performance coaches keep talking about getting a good pitch to hit. Got to stay quiet. Okay.
sure.
Well, how are you going to be quiet if the first part of the brain, okay, the only part of the brain, as I told Ken back in the day, that's external, how do you just simply discount that and fast forward it to the cognitive part of it? It makes no sense at all, both chronologically and neurologically, right? That a lot of the mental issues, a lot of the emotional baggage, a lot of the anxiety that the mental performance coaches are trying to help, it's too late. The way in which the eyes process that information sent bad information out. And again, to me, the best model is both. Right? And I know
Sure.
I'm being somewhat critical because I was there 10 years ago, Todd. I had the same tools, tricks, and strategies that Ken had and everyone else had. And I would help some, but the further up the food chain you got with the elite athletes, when the level of play gets tougher to do, I realized there had to be something else that we could share with the athletes, right? And when you start telling athletes, what if we got you to see the ball better? What if we got you to have better first step quickness? What if we use the eyes initially instead of talking about the thought process? They all love it. They all would love to talk about the seeing part of mental performance and then start going into the back and many times, you know, talking about things that either they don't want to talk about or they've heard since high school or college.
Sure, because it's the same thing, just saying it in a different way.
Correct.
Well, one observation. There's an outfielder in the MLB. He's kind of getting up there in years, and he played in Toronto, my hometown. Kevin Pillar, who I would say has, I don't think he has elite speed, but I've always thought he has unbelievable ability to read a baseball. Like he is gone. It feels like he knows where that ball is going to be. And he makes so many spectacular catches, I think, just because I think he has that ability. And I don't know whether he knows it or whether it's anything he's worked on, but that's something I've always felt, is that he can read a baseball coming off a bat better than many people. And, some guys are just super fast. They can run it down. He just seems to have that ability. And I want to ask you this question. I always felt like one of the things I used to talk to with young hitters too was like, your hands will go where your eyes take them. Was I, am I right in sort of that philosophy? Because it was kind of one of those things I was trying to get them to not worry about, oh, I got to swing, I got, this or whatever. It was just like, it's kind of like driving a car. You're driving a car, and if you look over there, pretty soon your car is going over there, right? And that was kind of my thought. Is that somewhat right? Is it flawed? What do you think?
I think it's right on the button. I'll give you another quote. Jay Johnson, who's the head coach at LSU, a client of mine. Yeah. And he was nice enough to write a foreword in the book for me. And his line, and I've heard him use it even after the visits, when you fix your eyes, you fix your swing. I mean, as simple as that is, if you make seeing the ball, right, and understanding space, right, if you fix your swing, fix your eyes, you fix your swing. And the problem is when athletes struggle, right, the immediate reaction is, I need to change my swing, or they're leaving the on deck circle with all kinds of thoughts and clutter. I got to remember to breathe into my bat. I've got to put in my affirmation. I've got to listen to my breath. I've got to make sure my routines are perfect. All things that I'm not poo-pooing totally, but I'm saying there's more to it. And yeah. I think you're right. When you fix your eyes, you fix your swing.
So how does an athlete start kind of, working on this? Like, if you're working with athletes saying, okay, look, we're going to work on your vision. Like, what are some of the things that you give them to do to try to start kind of working that way?
Well, it's interesting. And that happens a lot, right? When you tell them, I want to teach you to look at nothing. And I said it to a 15-year-old the other day with his parents there, and they're waiting for the punchline. And I said, okay, let's back up. Let's go outside. And the best way to start teaching open focus, this non-judgmental seeing, is to go outside where the eyes are so much more comfortable in not only looking at objects, but it's much easier, right, for the brain to have better spatial awareness because we're outside. And I think to be able to explain, I call it during orientation. I want you to look at me, and I'll sometimes just I want you to stare at the N in frozen ropes, right? I want you to burn a hole in it, because it's really important for you to see the ball out of the hand, because the harder you look, the more you'll see. And they'll agree with me. And I say, that's exactly wrong. That is called hyper-focus. That is why you can't hit a breaking ball. That's why you'll never get out of a ball. Okay? So then I want you simply to see my face, see the Nike swish, and see the end at the same time. I want you to kind of change how you're paying attention to that. And it's the beginning, Todd, of them understanding I can see. When I'm simply seeing, and I'm not locked into anything, right? If I'm not hyper focused, right? If my attention is what's called immersed, that I can still see the end, but I also see all of this other information. That's the beginning of them getting to understand this open focus. And really, most of my time is spent dismissing the stuff that they've heard.
Sure.
We got to watch spin, right? But we got to make sure we can see the spin, the seams of the ball. Newsflash coming right out of neuroscience: the brain does not have time to process spins and seams and whatnot. The brain sees patterns, it sees shapes. And so if you're telling your young hitter at 13 or 23 to really get locked into the Rapsodo spin rate and the seams, you are going in the wrong direction, because now the ball becomes the primary piece of attention. And
Sure.
You just lost sight of all the information that sits in front of the ball that we're saying is intel. That's space now. You don't get to see that anymore. The brain and the eyes need space to calculate time to collision. Okay, it's a very simple. Yeah. It's like we have our own GPS. The way in which we understand where we are in time and space for the brain is for them to say, all right, you know what? Todd is about maybe, 4 feet from the screen. Well, how do I know that? Well, the brain knows that because the space in between is real. And here's a great line. Space is invisible to the eyes, but not the brain. Space is invisible to the eyes, but the brain uses it to calculate information. Okay? And so, can you teach open focus to 10, 11, 12-year-olds? Absolutely, you can. We do it with 7, 8, 9-year-olds here. We have a group of children that are on ADHD medication. We talk about the ultimate, how open focus helps them. They are so locked in, they are so unaware that if they just simply let go and sat in a classroom and had all this wonderful space between them and their roommate, their teammate, and the teacher, and you start to get them to understand that, that's how you start teaching open focus.
I hit my microphone as I was clearing my throat and didn't keep on going. Yeah, I mean, you know what? I got a kid with ADHD, and that, should have found this out sooner, but never too late for sure. This, you know what? It's super fascinating, and it's as every bit enjoyable as I thought it would be, because, I kind of look at it and I think there's just more, like there's a whole package that comes with it. And I agree. Like I think a lot of the mental skills and different things are ways to kind of get yourself primed and maybe into into the flow or whatever everybody wants to talk about. But I think those are ways to kind of get yourself reminder what's going on. But I love the idea of the vision part, because I believe it to be true. I was a goalie growing up, and I was going to ask you about other sports and you working with other sports, but you mentioned it. And you know what? I was never I used to say I was the 5th goalie in a 4 goalie system. So I was, kind of almost there, but not quite good enough. But I was pretty good. And what I prided myself on a lot is old time, no butterflies and all that other stuff, was sort of just reaction time like that. I don't think I never really got locked in on a puck. I did actually look at reading what was happening. What was that guy going to do?
Here's the puck. You saw the blade of the stick, but you're what's really important right now. You were smart enough to realize, you know what? This thing is about to come at me at 80, 90 miles an hour. So you saw the blade come down and intersect the puck, but you were way ahead of the game at that point. You had good spacing at that point. So when the puck came out, you were seeing more of where the puck was going and less of where it's been. And this is a problem with the hitters. Okay, they get stuck on the back of the ball. The ball comes out, and they've been fixated on see it out of the hand. This ball comes out. When you're 1/1000th of a second late on a ball coming at you at 90 miles an hour, you are in what's called visual chaos now. Now the eyes are starting to have to catch up to see where the trajectory of that ball is going to be. But yeah, whether it's the hockey goaltender, whether it's hitting or whatnot, that same understanding pertains. There's no question about it. And I think you're right, Todd. I think, and Alan Jaeger and I spend time with, how do we take the mental performance model that's out there that everybody wants, and everyone, there is a benefit to an extent. How do you modify it at some point, and how do you eventually weed them off? How do you eventually, right, that the strategies and techniques, when does self-awareness come in? And this whole thing about the zone, I've got the same article that I wrote before, okay? This zone, right, and you talk to 20 million different people what the zone is. Freedom, joy, purpose, clarity is not a heightened state. It's our natural state. We have trouble finding it because we have been taught to seek a heightened state that doesn't exist. And seeing it veil our natural state. Stop seeking, live. And this whole happiness is always there. It's either veiled or unveiled. And if you start with that premise, it's a different way of looking at this mental performance puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I love it. This is really good stuff. So I end all my episodes going into some rapid fire questions. So I'm gonna fire a few at you and see what you have to say. What's one book you would recommend everyone to read?
Besides mine,
Yeah, but you can say your own, but I like it. Yeah.
I would read Sydney Banks, the
Okay.
Enlightened Gardener. Okay.
Cool.
I would. Garrett Kramer has a book that's out now, called Inside Out Living. Tremendous book, changed my life, and got me to understand about self, and got me to understand that maybe the traditional mental performance model might need some tweaking.
Gotcha. Cool. What's one thing a listener can do right now to maybe make a change in their, I like to use the word mindset, but I mean, how can they better themselves in their sport? What can they do to kind of make a change in the right direction?
Go outside and play. Go outside, and when you see trees and mountains and sunsets or whatnot, right, be so aware of how good that you feel, right? Let your eyes tell you, wow, if I can feel this way when I'm 60 feet 6 inches away from an oncoming fastball, that's kind of a good thing. Go outside and stumble into open focus. That would be the best advice. And if you can somehow be aware of that, and keep some of that non-hyper-focused attention level when you're getting ready to throw a pitch as a pitcher or hitter, that's the beginning of some good new stuff.
Yeah, cool. What advice would you pass along to teenage you?
Teenage me?
Yeah, teenage you. What would you tell yourself now that you're further down the path?
It's probably what I tell my two children who are not teenagers anymore. I think in life and in a profession, you need to stay curious, Todd.
Oh, I agree.
In anything that we do, I think we become dangerous as professionals. We become dangerous as teenagers when we actually stop looking or believe that just because somebody has a cool logo or they're older than us, they become the authority. I think that's probably the best advice. And I know when I was that age, if it was the teacher, the professor, it was gospel. And I now realize that I could have learned a lot more on my own by being a little bit more curious every time that the quote establishment or this is what's going on.
Yeah, no, I literally could not agree more. It's one of the things I've had a career in the corporate world as well. And I when people talk, oh, what are your strengths? I go, I'm curious. I am. I like learning. I like talking to people like yourselves. And that's where, this podcast coming out, people going like, oh, you just started a podcast. I go, well, I thought about it for a long time about it's something that I'm very interested and passionate in. And I really think that kids need people like yourself to give them other perspectives. So how they can better themselves, not even just in sport, but just in general in life. But part of it was, I had a background in communications. I was a journalism student, so maybe that's what made me curious. So I'm just curious about where do we go from here? How does this get you there? What, all those different pieces that come together. So
and tying it in, great athletes, their visual skills, they're curious. They see more things than other people. Look at curiosity a different way. Manny Ramirez was elite, right? Rod Carew, Tony Gwynn. Those guys had curiosity. And the only way you can have curiosity in the visual system is by having your eyes in what's called a smooth pursuit. They're constantly looking for intel, right? That curiosity is the portal to open focus. That's why we feel so good outside, because we're curious about the landscape and the birds and the trees and all of the other stimulus. So curiosity on two different levels. That was a good one.
Best piece of advice you ever received?
I mean, I'm thinking of my mom who passed away recently, who was my role model. She was the patriarch of the company that I started. Don't let anyone ever tell you or let someone else's opinion define how you feel about yourself.
Good advice.
We actually built I have the bracelet on FOPO. FOPO are the 10 commandments of FOPO. I talk about it in my book. Forgive others, pray often. Forget other people's opinion. And when you get a little bit older, you can replace forget with rhymes like duck. So that's very important. I think that's a very important mantra for teenagers, that the only opinion that really should matter in life has to be their own, not what other people are thinking about them.
Such a hard lesson for them to live. I have 4 kids. I've got one who will remain nameless, but that's a problem for her.
Yes, it is.
Well, I said her. I put it down to one. But yeah, she's, and look at it. We're in a world now where everybody's being compared instantly in the online world, and I think it gets harder and harder and harder to understand that. But that is a good piece of advice. Don't.
How old are your children?
34, 32, almost 20, and 17.
Okay. Oh, I'm going to, since you're my new friend, I'm going to send you a copy of my book.
Awesome.
She might not like the part one. You'll enjoy because it's more about visual psychology, but part two of it is all about FOPO. It's all about the WTF rule in life. We can wallow in the fog, or we can work to fix. And there's small little chapters that were written just for 15 to 19-year-olds to be able to digest and hopefully arouse some curiosity as to
that's awesome.
how they should maybe change some of their habits.
That is awesome. And my final question is, who would you suggest as a potential future guest for this podcast? This is where I crowdsource all my ideas.
Well, I'll tell you right now, I mean, Garrett Kramer will, I mean, if you thought I was a little critical or challenging the status quo in mental performance, he'll blow them up.
Right.
He's really good. Alan Jaeger, right? Who was everyone knows Alan because of the Jaeger bands.
Sure.
Right? His work in meditation. He's a tremendous human being. I think those are two guys that would really add to what you're trying to build on your platform.
Well, we'll definitely try to manifest that.
Yeah.
Tony, I appreciate your time.
All good.
Good luck on your trip to the Dominican Republic. And I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed this, people. All Tony's information and links to all his stuff will be found in the show notes. Tony, thank you once again. Have a great day.
Todd. Stay in good space today.
Thank you.
Okay.